In George Floyd's hometown of Houston, trying to keep his memory alive, NBC News correspondent Dan Lieberman spoke with Floyd's inner circle about how they intend to honor his legacy. Here's a preview of his story for the NBC News Quibi show, The Report.
What do you think George would make of this moment?
For me personally, knowing him and the heart that he have, he would be proud. He wasn't really for violence, but I do understand that some circumstances across the world, you have a lot of people abusing authority and mistreat people, and we have to stand and fight for something.
We built this goddamn country. If you didn't want black people here, you shouldn't have brought them here in the first goddamn place. But we here now, and we're not leaving. And I'm not going to bow down to no oppressors. F that.
Dan Lieberman joins me now. Dan, you had the chance to speak with people that were closest to George Floyd. How is he being remembered?
Hey, Gotti, it's good to be with you. We spent the last week in the 3rd Ward in Houston. This was the neighborhood where George Floyd grew up, and we spoke to people who knew him best. These were friends he lived with. These are musicians that he inspired. They credit George Floyd with really making a positive path in their own life, really creating positivity throughout the neighborhood and in their lives. It was interesting, that clip that you heard there, it's from 2 of Houston's most famous rappers. It was Trae the Truth and Bun B, and they really sort of credit George Floyd with starting a whole movement and really this is a turning point. In the neighborhood, we spoke with neighbors, and everyone there really feels like this is the beginning of something new that we haven't seen before. And they all believe that his death will not be in vain. And there's really an optimism that we saw in everyone that we talked to, even though there's so much anger.
And Dan, Floyd's inner circle seems to be pushing for change, demanding an end to racial injustice. Can you tell us a little bit about the specifics on what they want to see done?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, obviously, top of mind is police reform. But broader than that, they want to see systemic change. When we talk to people in the community, they say too many young men of color growing up in these communities, just like George Floyd, they don't want them to meet the same fate. And they want to see changes. They want to see more investment in the communities like the 3rd Ward in Houston, more money into education and engagement, and treating people with dignity. That was a word that really stuck with me in talking to people, where the optimism comes in. There's actually a moment here where people feel like everyone across the world is standing with them and coming together, supporting real change. And maybe in years past, in other moments where we've seen too many black people killed at the hands of police, they say this is a different moment. This is finally a moment they've been waiting for that's just long overdue. So it's a broad set of changes they're looking for. We also heard that there's a lot of movement on getting out the vote, that people who maybe felt disenfranchised in the past are going to be galvanized around this moment to really step in and see positive change at the forefront here.
Dan, thanks so much for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing your full report.
Thank you, Guy.
And you can catch Dan's full story on The Report by NBC News. Just download the Quibi app on any mobile device. And protesters are zeroing in on Confederate statues and monuments, taking them down amid outrage over the death of George Floyd. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are more than 1,700 public symbols of the Confederacy across the United States. In some cities, those monuments are being toppled and vandalized during the protest. Karen Cox, professor of history and director of public history at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, joins me now. Karen is writing a book on the legacy of Confederate monuments in the United States. Karen, I want to start with a little bit of historical context. When were most of these monuments put up and why?
Well, it's good to be here. Most of these monuments were placed in the decades between 1890 and 1920. This was at least 30 40 and 50 years after the Civil War ended. The primary reason they're there is an organization known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They were organized in 1894 and were on a quick campaign of building monuments in about every town square, on every boulevard, around cities and small towns throughout the South. And they also did things like name highways, name parks, name bridges after Confederate heroes. So those are part of the symbols in that 1700, but there are just about between 700 and 800 actual Confederate monuments, the statues that we're seeing being torn down.
And we've heard critics of tearing down these monuments say that the statutes aren't about hatred, they're about preserving heritage. What's your response to that?
That's a narrative that goes back to right after the Civil War. There is this sense that, after defeat and the emasculation of Southern men in that war, that there's this sense that we have to kind of build them back up, so to speak. And so the narrative then becomes that this is nothing more than about history and honoring a heritage, even though that heritage includes defeat. On the flip side of that, and those are monument defenders, on the flip side, you have Black Southerners who had to grow up with these statues in their communities that often sit adjacent to courthouses where they expect to receive justice. And these monuments have been sitting there for over a century and sending out message like they're long felt this way, and now they're finally being joined by a more progressive white Southern.
And sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties there, Karen. I'm not sure if you could still hear me, but in your opinion, if these statues are removed, what should happen to them? Should they be preserved in a museum? Should they be destroyed? Tell us what your take is.
So the thing that's important for people to understand is that these monuments are intensely local objects. So what's going to need to happen is for each community, should they decide to remove their monument, to decide exactly how they wish to dispose of it. Do they want to put it in a park? Do they want take it out of a park? Do they want to put it on private property? Does it go into a cemetery? Maybe it goes to a museum, but the museums, it's difficult to put that on museums who may have collections policies that don't include collecting Confederate monuments, although they might include local history. So I think there are going to be a variety of ways in which communities will respond and once they've removed them, if they in fact do remove them, and could include things like art installations. For example, taking some of these monuments that have been spray painted with graffiti and have them placed somewhere else.
And Karen, you've been tracking a lot of these controversies over decades, and yet it still seems like we're having the same discussion. Does anything feel differently this time?
I think the difference this time is not that you're right, these discussions seem to never get resolved. And because, you're on one side or the other side of this and not very much exists in between. And so what makes this moment different, of course, is the critical mass of people that it's not just in a few cities, but it's in many, and even in small towns around the South. I mean, very small towns. It's been, those folks have been added, their voices have been added to this conversation. And but at the same time, we have state laws that were passed right after the Charlottesville uprising, and that prevent the removal, even to a museum. And so I think these laws are going to get challenged by local communities once more. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll definitely see. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen.
Sure. Thank you.
In the wake of protests and national conversations on race, there is a growing push to support Black Lives Matter and Black-owned businesses. Hashtags like Support Black Lives Businesses are widely circulating online, and according to Google Trends, searches for how to find Black-owned businesses in your area has spiked this month. NBC News business and tech correspondent Jolene Kent joins me now. Joe, some major companies are also pitching in to show some solidarity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, almost every company, Gotti, has made a statement in support of Black Lives Matter, at least the major players here, the publicly traded companies. But you also have companies doing a little bit more than that. One of them is Sephora. They've adopted the 15% pledge. It's a pledge created by a woman in New York named Aurora James. And the idea is that they say 15% of Americans' population is Black. And so they want to see that reflected on shelves when it comes to stores. So Sephora is now saying that it's going to take action and evaluate what is on their store shelves, what's available online, and figure out what they need to do to reach a 15% threshold for products from Black-owned businesses to have their space on the shelves. And an executive at Sephora says this is not just lip service, if you will, to this issue, this ongoing challenge that our society is facing, but the idea is that you want to change not only the standards of beauty, but also transform the supply chain, right? And give people a better shot, a more legitimate shot at actually representing what they do. So it's an interesting challenge by Sephora, and this is a 15% pledge that the organization out of New York is challenging Whole Foods to do the same thing and other companies.
And Joe, on the local level, when it comes to some of those mom and pop shops, how critical is this boost of support during this pandemic, especially since we know that Black communities are disproportionately affected by the coronavirus?
Yeah, disproportionately affected by the coronavirus as well as unemployment. And so, yeah, the small businesses that we've talked to say that they hope that the movement that we are seeing right now is more than just a trend on social media or a hashtag. In fact, I spoke to a small business owner in Seattle, Bridget Johnson, and she owns a cafe and smoothie bar. And they've been affected by the COVID shutdowns, but also she's seeing some encouraging signs of what's to come given the protests. Here's what she had to tell us.
On Instagram, they had the blackout, for one day where, support small local minority businesses. We were swamped, and so we are thankful for that. It's not only that one day. Yeah, that one day is going to help, but, stop back by once a week.
Yeah, so Bridget's point there is this needs to be a long-term impact. And so small businesses are trying to take advantage of the moment, of course, but also turn it into something that's more permanent, Gotti, because we know that so much inequality stems from your socioeconomic abilities or your background. And there's so much discrimination entrenched in that. And so small businesses saying, look, we are more than just a hashtag or a social media moment.
Well, hopefully that moment and that momentum continues. Thanks so much, Joe.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.